Today we're going to examine a critical mineral with applications across the military, electronics and renewable energy sectors, which is tungsten. Global supply is heavily concentrated in China, which produces around 80% of the world's tungsten, and Beijing imposed strict export restrictions last year. Well, since then, Western governments and industries have been scrabbling to secure alternative sources as prices rise. Well, with me in the studio is Matthew Campbell, an analyst at C5 Capital, to explain what's driving this and what it means for the supply security. Hi, Matthew. So nice to see you again.
Lovely to see you again, Linda.
So, Matthew, can we look at tungsten and more deeply at why prices have just rocketed this year?
Yeah, so I think it's important when looking at tungsten to give a little bit of background before we dive into what's driving this price movement. So tungsten is a pretty special element on the periodic table. It is the metal with the highest melting point of any element. It also has the highest boiling point of any element. And that boiling point is around 5,500 degrees, which is roughly the same temperature as the surface of the sun. Tungsten also at room temperature does not react with things like oxygen or with water or with most acids. And it's also extremely dense, roughly comparable to, say, uranium or to gold, and about 1.7 times denser than lead, which means if you have a cube maybe the size of a golf ball, it's weighing in somewhere closer to a bowling ball. So it's a pretty unique thing, and humans have had access to this, I mean, really for kind of 150 years. It was first discovered in the 18th century, but didn't have so many uses then. Now, grandparents and parents may have had more exposure to it than maybe we have been aware of, because for a long time, given its high melting point, it was used as a filament in early filament bulbs. And actually, Thomas Edison with General Electric tried to patent the metal tungsten. It was I believe, the only element on the periodic table that has tried to have a patent put on it. Naturally, it failed. But then since then, its primary use has been in a couple of different things. In the early 20th century, there was a real scramble between the European powers and the Americans to get access to tungsten for the weapons industry. And this was obviously around the time of the First and Second World War. The reason you want tungsten is because if you think, like, imagine a tank, it's firing a projectile, and really it has two ways of destroying its target. You have a kind of conventional approach, which is put some explosive in it, it hits and it explodes. The problem there is you then have to carry all of this live ammunition in your tank. And I'm sure many people watching and listening will have seen those incredible videos from Ukraine and from Syria, where Russian T-72s, they get hit and all the ammunition inside cooks off and it fires the turret up into the air. So that's not great. So what a lot of Western tanks, especially like the American Abrams and some of the European designs, is they use basically kinetic rounds. And that's you fire something very heavy, very quickly, and you simply rely on it hitting and punching directly through armor without any use of explosive. There's a couple of options for this, but you want something very dense and very hard. One option is depleted uranium, which is uranium that has been used in a reactor and has less of the fissile radioactive element. The problem with this stuff is it's quite expensive, it's quite rare, and it is still radioactive, so you need extra precautions. Your other option is to use tungsten or an alloy of tungsten, which does effectively the same job and is far cheaper, and it means that your poor little 18-year-old you've drafted in doesn't get radiation sickness from handling the ammo. So this was used right through the First and Second World War. The Second World War, interestingly, there was a massive scramble for tungsten like you're seeing today, where the major supplier was Portugal. And you had the Axis powers wanted the tungsten, the Allied powers wanted the tungsten. Portugal was next to Franco as Spain, which is Axis aligned, but Portugal had a long-standing alliance with the British, and so ultimately the Allies went out then. But I mention that because it becomes very relevant to what we will be discussing today, where you see the US and China especially tussling over this material. Now, kind of bringing it back to today, the numbers that really matter. World mine production in 2025 was about 85,000 tons. And this is from the United States Geological Survey. Some of it should be taken with a pinch of salt because the vast majority of that is coming from China, about 80% of global mined production. For context, the second place is Vietnam, which has 3,000 tons versus China's 67,000. So the Chinese really are the leaders in this space. And then there's a few others in Kazakhstan, North Korea, a few in Europe and Africa. Now, if you add up every Western aligned producer, you get roughly 2,800 tons, which is 4% of what China is producing by itself. And if we go to reserves, it's exactly the same story. The global world reserves are at about 4.7 million tons. And China alone is holding 2.5 million of that, more than half of the planet's known reserves in the ground. Then the next issue you have is, as you go to mine, it's great, but it's coming out as an ore. And there's two main types of ore, one called wolfram and one called scheelite. These need processing. And while China has 80% of global mining, it has 85% of global processing capability. And so even when you're mining in Africa, when a lot of the mining done in Europe, you're simply shipping it over to China, they're processing it and then selling it. So this becomes a real problem for supply chains. The number, the numbers we're talking about in terms of price movement was, I think, 350% growth in the last, year it was?
It was 350%.
Yeah, which is huge. I think it's worth just adding a slight bit of caveat to those figures because the tungsten market is not big. It's very opaque and it's very thinly traded. And so, when you look at the Brent crude price, that's a pretty accurate reflection of what you might get on the market. It's a lot harder with tungsten, and a lot of it is done over the counter as opposed to in these centralized exchanges. The other thing to bear in mind is you're trading not pure tungsten, you're trading an intermediary product, which then does need refining. And so all of this is benefiting China. But I think the central point to this, the price, whatever the actual change in supply demand is, it's undoubtable that demand is exploding relative to supply. And the central point here around this demand shock is in February 2025, China put tungsten under export licensing for the first time. Then in December, it went further and named 15 companies that it would allow to export tungsten in 2026 and 2027. And I believe this was under a weird rolling contract that gets reviewed every 30 days. And so, if you're a US company and you think you have a relationship in China, the CCP can strip it within 30 days' time, should they choose to. What this led to is that China's APT export, so APT is this intermediary that it's using, these collapsed by around 70%, from 782 tons in 2024 down to just 243 in 2025. But there's another number in there that goes back to what I said at the start about trusting the global production. China is the vast majority of mine production. Its own mine production actually fell in 2025 by around 10% to 61,000 tons. And this is largely driven by aging deposits and environmental crackdowns on smaller producers. And so Beijing is simultaneously restricting its exports and producing less itself. Beijing, as is the case with most of the minerals and metals and other elements we talk about, are well ahead of the West. They recognize these are not commodities. These are strategic assets. And they are working hard now to really punish the West, squeeze that supply, and force the price up.
So while the West is now scrambling, so, where are we actually seeing new mining and processing capacity being developed, to ensure that there is a steady supply?
Yeah, there is genuine movement on this outside of China. So on the mining point of view, probably the standout is a mine in South Korea, which I think restarted in July. I think it might be this month it restarted. Anyway, sorry, this is run by a company called Almonty, one of the bigger tungsten miners in the world. And it was a mine that dates back right into the 20th century, but has been dormant for about 3 decades. Phase one of this is processing about 640,000 tons of ore annually, which would produce kind of 2,500 tons of concentrate in a year. So that's, it's not insignificant. It's still a fraction of Chinese supply, but a step in the right direction. The second phase, which should begin in around 2027, doubles that, so that you're producing in the region of 4,500 to 5,000 tons of concentrate. So, more than 5% of global supply at this point. And that would actually cover around 40% of tungsten demand outside of China. So hugely important. Then there's a cluster of Western and Western aligned projects. So there's one in Nevada that's a little smaller, but doing similar ideas, similar timelines. And under the US Defense Production Act, they're awarding further ones in the US and a couple that they're supporting in Canada. And then there's also a US-Kazakh joint venture, which was announced late last year. And this is backed by, I think, $900 million from the US Export-Import Bank, and targets, if fully scaled up, 12,000 tons of tungsten every year, which would be about 15% of global output. And then the other one to maybe mention is in Rwanda. So they have a big mine run by Trinity Metals, and it's the largest tungsten mine in Africa, producing around 30 tons a month. And Trinity's looking at expanding its operations, opening a second tungsten mine. It is Western aligned, and so will become an important alternative to buying from China.
Are there any in the DRC?
The DRC has limited capacity. Where the DRC comes into this is that, and it's something that if you're buying from Rwanda, you have to consider. It still remains fairly opaque, these supply chains, and so while it may be mined physically in Rwanda, some of the work can be done in the DRC. And especially for the US, which is now cracking down hard on the tungsten supply chains beyond just where is it mined. You're right, the DRC is a real question mark over these kind of deep Southern African tungsten supplies. I think perhaps more importantly, the bigger point is that mining is not really the choke point. Ramping up a mine, yes, it takes 5-7 years. But the real choke point is on the chemical plant, because that concentrate has to be converted into APT before it's useful for anything. And as I mentioned earlier, China controls 85% of this world processing capacity. So while these new mines are exciting, perhaps a more exciting one is this other company called Global Tungsten and Powders, which is part of a group called Plancy. And they're expanding their tungsten oxide capacity, i.e. this ability to process in Pennsylvania, to around 12,000 tons a year, which would feed a new US strategic tungsten reserve. And this is super important because the US set itself a target, which I think we'll go on to talk about, which effectively means that from the start of 2027, it cannot buy tungsten for defense purposes that has been mined, processed, or had any involvement in the Chinese part of the supply chain. Which, great, well done. Very actually European in its approach by really digging into where these things come from. They haven't made many steps beyond what I've just said to actually reach that target and be able to deliver on that target in time for the deadline, which is in 5 months' time.
So, what else is, say, the UK doing to ensure that there is supply of tungsten?
The UK is doing what it is very good at, and which it learns from its European friends, and that is saying a lot of things without doing anything. Tungsten is on our critical minerals list. And actually, there is a genuinely large dormant asset here in Devon, which is one of the largest tungsten deposits in the world. But it has been through repeated commercial failures, restart attempts over the last 10 years. And this is kind of part of a wider issue with British strategic and sovereign capability. You look at that part of the world, Devon and Cornwall, not only is it tungsten, this used to be a real mining center for the British Empire. And while they've taken out a lot of things like tin, there's a lot of other really important elements in there, one of which is lithium. But the lithium exploration is having the same issue as tungsten. They've got the capability to dig it out of the ground without really disturbing anybody. But because of UK law, UK planning law, environmental regulation, it becomes hugely expensive. And so what the British government needs to do, that the Americans have already woken up to, is accept the fact that this is expensive. It is not cheap to get rid of China and start doing it yourself. But if you believe the prevailing wisdom that China is a strategic adversary that is likely to engage in some kind of armed or similar engagement with the Western world in the next 5 to 10 years, you kind of need to invest in it now, take the hit, so that if to put it politely, if things hit the fan, you're not caught with your pants down, which we currently are.
Are you saying this should be processed locally in the UK?
It shouldn't necessarily be processed in the UK. We're not the cheapest place to do it. However, we have a lot of friends elsewhere and we can mine it here. I would suggest it's worthwhile, if not mining here now, at least putting everything in place such that if you need to switch to a UK supply, you can ramp it up within 6 months and you build up that reserve, to cover the 6 months. What the UK should be doing, and what the EU is starting to do, is look at moving that production and moving that refining out of China, either into the EU or into friendly jurisdictions. So the EU is very good in that, unlike the UK, it has said things and has now put money in. So a few years back, they had 2 fantastic initiatives which are still running. One was Repower EU, which was effectively trying to diversify energy supply away from Russia. And the second is Resource EU. And this was adopted by the European Commission late last year, along with 6 billion euros of funding just for 2026. And this was effectively to fast track a series of strategic projects that would help the EU reduce its reliance on strategic adversaries. So it had several kind of 50, 60 projects which it was looking at. Some of them for rare earth like molybdenum, some of them like lithium. Then on tungsten specifically, the EU shortlisted it alongside rare earths like gallium, magnesium, graphite, to create a jointly coordinated strategic mineral reserve, similar to what the United States already have. And this would sit under a new EU critical raw materials center that would run joint purchasing, manage reserves, look at a stockpiling scheme, and is really spearheaded by Italy, France, and Germany. It's all good, and they've made some serious progress towards actioning this across the entire rare earths supply chain, but they're still a long way behind where they need to be. The EU does its own audits pretty forensically. They published a report earlier in this year that was fairly damning, found that the diversification efforts have produced, in its own words, no tangible results, and that domestic processing capacity is actually declining because of how high energy costs are. The auditor went on to say that the EU is now dangerously dependent on just a handful of countries outside of its bloc, and that the funding mechanisms, drawdown protocols, and the kind of replenishment processes for the tungsten stockpile have not been set up properly and are not publicly disclosed. So on paper, it's a serious effort, and more serious than maybe a lot of observers are giving Brussels credit for, but possibly driven by the series of crises that have affected the continent in the last couple of years, they're still well behind.
So tungsten isn't really central to the nuclear reactors that we have at the moment, but used in experimental fusion reactors because it can withstand plasma, in temperatures that's, as hot as the sun's core. Well, that's my layman's understanding. So can you explain, why would tungsten not be as important to nuclear reactors that we use now, but the ones of the future, it might become really important?
Yes, and this is where you might need to stop me on going too deep into the science.
Okay, you have 2 minutes.
So quickly on the difference between fission and fusion, people will likely be aware that you maybe have a nuclear bomb and you have a thermonuclear bomb. Nuclear is you take a heavy element like uranium or plutonium, you fire a neutron at it, and it splits in half. And as it splits, it releases energy. Thermonuclear is where you take two light elements. It can be with a range of elements up to iron, but it's normally hydrogen. And you take two atoms of hydrogen, and under extremely high heat and pressure, you fuse them together. This also releases energy, and it produces helium. Now, there are what we call isotopes of hydrogen. So this is effectively, you have an atom, which is a nucleus and electrons, and within that atom, you have protons and neutrons. There are three isotopes of hydrogen. Protium, which is just a proton, deuterium, which has a proton and a neutron, and tritium, which has a proton and two neutrons. Now, protium, just the proton, is the most abundant. It's about 99.8% of all hydrogen in the universe. And this is what you see in the sun. The issue is, if you're trying to force together two protons, which are positively charged, you need an enormous amount of energy. And effectively, during that process, without getting too complex, one proton turns into a neutron. This works in the sun because it's massive. And so, frankly, a proton can sit in there for about 1 billion years before ever fusing with another one. But you have enough of them going on that it produces all the energy that we need to survive. To replicate those conditions on Earth would be effectively impossible. So what we use is deuterium, which is slightly less common and is used, if it's in water, is called heavy water, which you may have heard of, used in a lot of nuclear reactors. And then we also use tritium, which is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. Now we have to produce tritium using lithium. It's a little short-lived, so there's almost none of this in the world, and it's produced specifically for fusion. But the point being, if we fuse these two together, the heat and temperature you need is a lot less. The challenge you get is, even with all of these caveats in place, we're still talking in the tens of millions of degrees. And so to hold everything in, you need something which is extremely hard and extremely resistant to heat. And this is where tungsten comes in. Previously, the big kind of fusion projects like the ITER project in France have been using beryllium, but they have recently transitioned almost entirely to using tungsten. And effectively, they have these enormous supercooled magnets, which hold in a kind of plasma, which is a superheated charged gas where all of the fusion is taking place. And this tungsten coats all of these magnets that protects them, because when you have the fusion, you get helium, but you also get a really fast moving neutron. And as this neutron shoots out, it hits whatever wall is around it. And, you know, it's not a charged particle. And so if you're using magnets to hold it in, they don't hold it in. It just passes straight through. It will hit the wall, and you get two things happen. Firstly, it can knock atoms off, which slowly degrades your wall, hence why we want something like tungsten that's super sturdy. And it also can knock electrons, or can actually pump straight into the nucleus and create a radioactive isotope. And so you end up with your magnets gradually become radioactive. Tungsten does this slightly less than other options, but it still gets neutron activation and becomes radioactive. And so why it's so important to the tungsten supply chain is that you can't just build a reactor and put the tungsten in place. It's constantly being eroded and degraded. And so you need to replace it, these massive magnets, every couple of years. There have been some studies, and it's worth caveating this immediately, that one of these studies was funded by a tungsten miner. But they estimate that if you ramped up a full fusion fleet in the same way that nuclear fission is being deployed across the UK and the US, you would effectively consume the entire world's supply of tungsten every single year.
Oh, goodness. Oh, yeah. That sounds so interesting because, fusion is so unproven at commercial scale. Although, that you had that demonstration at the Lawrence Livermore Labs in 2022. So this seems to be quite far into the future that we're talking about.
Yeah, so there's a saying in the fusion industry which is, fusion's always a decade away. And they've been saying this since the 80s, still saying it now. It does feel like we're getting closer. I think there are a couple of American companies that say they're going to get fusion on the grid by 2032. They're not. But we are moving closer. The Livermore milestone, which was, a few years ago, was genuinely important, but I think maybe slightly misunderstood. So what they achieved was ignition, effectively getting more energy out of the fuel than the lasers delivered to it for the first time in history. The fusion they're doing is it's not completely different. It's a very different way of achieving fusion to what they're doing in France. So in France, you're trying to create a plasma that will be continuous, and you have to hold it in using these magnets. What Livermore is doing is they're taking a fuel pellet and they're getting a vast array of lasers and using mirrors to concentrate it into a single point. It's a lot easier to do that. The challenge is you then have to find a way to replace the pellets with the next fuel thing, because you use all of that fuel. And so they and a fair few commercial companies now are looking at how you do kind of pulsed lasers to achieve the same thing. Now, the advantage there would be you're not reliant on quite as many magnets. You still need radiation shielding, which is another thing tungsten can be used for. But you're not, using these enormous 10-ton solid blocks of tungsten to hold everything in.
Also interesting. Matthew Campbell, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.